Cyberpunk as a genre has noticed a progressive rise in popularity in mainstream culture. Despite this, it's not a particularly popular genre for AA games. While more prominent in the indie scene, even then it can often be limited in presentation and scope. More importantly than anything, the fantasy of Cyberpunk has, in some instances, not been delivered, at least in the popular conception of it. Many games attempt to deliver on a desired fantasy of the players to live out, some due to experiences in film, for example. I mean, who hasn't seen The Lord of the Rings and wanted to play exactly that? Cyberpunk 2077 intends to deliver on the fantasy of Cyberpunk that a lot of people have had in their imaginations. That, with the coupled meteoric success of CDPR with the Witcher series, and especially The Witcher 3, there was high ambitions in the imagination of many, as it represents a game so perfect in quality, scope, and its ability to realize the extent of the fantasy that it couldn't possibly disappoint. We're even seeing a similar cycle of hype in another game intent on delivering a somewhat similar, not quite reach fantasy, that being Star Citizen for the space sim, open-ended exploration, combat, and trade genre. However, is it true that Cyberpunk has been the only game to deliver on such a cyberpunk fantasy? Probably not, as Deus Ex has been the reigning champ for FPS RPG open-ended cyberpunk games, as near early as 2000 with the release of the original. However, due to the scope of the games being much smaller due to their hub-based design, they might not have been enough for some people. Or with the series being indefinitely put on hold, there may be more of a hunger for more cyberpunk. So that's why in this video I wanted to compare and contrast cyberpunk experiences with similar intentions and styles and see how they compare to each other. For the sake of scope, I'll only be focusing on Human Revolution, and not all the other Deus Ex games, as that would just be too much to cover, at least for now. However, I will compare them and mention them here and there. Moving on, so what truly is cyberpunk? I mean, it's the namesake of CDPR's game, and, it's based on the genre. Does that mean Cyberpunk 2077 should encapsulate all the tropes and everything people associate with the genre? Or should it redefine expectations? Cyberpunk, for better or worse, is more often within its narrative and presentation a greatest hit sort of collection of genre tropes, but with a whole lot of style and substance. So, is it truly punk? I'd say so, yeah. People may come into it expecting Cyberpunk to appeal to their personal beliefs, or may find themselves disappointed it doesn't match their personal views of punk. Look, the thing is, punk is a theme and an idea is really, really broad. It's worth noting that it's not invalid to want or desire our media to represent us. But I also think it's absurd to demand a game heavily follow genre conventions in every sense, especially considering how many genre conventions it already follows. Some have noted it's not punk enough because V does not conform nearly as much to Silverhand's views or their own personal views in the choices that they have and the actions they can take in the game. The game has even gotten some flack for its police-related open-world encounters, in which the player is rewarded presumably by the police for doing vigilante justice within the city, which is more of an indication of Night City's decay than anything of a pro-police stance. I don't think it's really worth getting too hung up on this for a couple reasons. For starters, popular cyberpunk media involves cops or police-like figures such as Blade Runner, Ghost in the Shell, or Deus Ex. That doesn't necessarily mean they have positive views of them, it's just that oftentimes the main protagonists can be figures of authority. Secondly, cyberpunk is not often, at least exclusively anyway, about the punk aspect, and I'm speaking broadly of the genre here. It can often cover themes of transhumanism, capitalism, or not at all. I mean, it is just window dressing after all, and rule of cool is also an incredibly valid reason to use a setting. The genre's naming conventions is less accurate these days anyway, as it's kind of just used because it sounds cool, I guess. I mean, it's similar with immersive sims or Metroidvanias. It's not probably the best word we could be using, but it's the best we got. Secondly, it's important to understand the gameplay affordances that need to exist for content to exist, such as in regards to the vigilante-related side activities. Generally, they need an excuse to do things even if they don't really make quite sense for the player. A lot of games do this. I don't really think it's worth being too upset over it, even though it's definitely not great within the context, but I think it works. Thirdly, the NPC in question in the side quest in which the player can refer to them as a good cop, is actually an indigenous detective who finds himself forced out of the police force due to rampant corruption. Maybe he really is the last good cop in Night City, but Night City definitely doesn't want him to be. The game doesn't necessarily have a pro or against stance on these issues, which may be an issue for some, but it's more interested in exploring the human element of why people do things that they do. Regardless, V is very much a punk in every sense. What kind of punk he or she is entirely dependent on you. I think this was the design intent of CDPR, much like it was before with Geralt. Before we get further, I think it's worth acknowledging the elephant in the room in regards to Cyberpunk. In my personal experience with my rig, I had no significant performance issues. Bugs were frequent, but not frequent enough to be too distracting, and none game breaking. However, this is not the case for everyone who played it. Further, the video will not focus too heavily on stability on launch, as this will undoubtedly patch over time, including patches and the aforementioned free DLC that CDPR has said they'll be rolling out sometime this year. And that, with regular expansions, the experience could change for better or worse a whole lot. And this review might even be outdated by then, as it's more of a critique of my personal experience, and less so a review of a product, if anything. Night City, for all intents and purposes, is most likely one of the greatest technical achievements in recent games history. It's an utter marvel at scope and the size of the thing. The bustle and hums of the city during the day, to its eerie ambience in fog, is a sight to behold. It's the type of open-world environment that could only be dreamed of 10 years ago. The benefit of its futuristic setting being rather obvious, as it can breathe a whole lot of new life and wonder than traditional, more modern settings can, such as in the GTA series. Being both familiar and alien every step of the way, the city truly does feel alive, even if at a passing glance. Gone are the days of only 10 NPCs in New Vegas' allegedly busiest locations. However, much of this splendor is predicated on a big illusion. Like many games, a lot of work has gone into making you believe in the illusion more than anything, as it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. Stare at the cracks too long and you're gonna break the whole illusion. Like with The Witcher 3, CD Projekt excels at setting through its environment and tone than its gameplay or in-depth interaction. Both The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk seem a lot deeper on the surface, but are much more artificial deep down. Most of the NPCs in Novigrad really aren't going to react that independently or crazily towards Geralt. However, this is not the case for many games, and it's a bit unfair to be overly critical of the game outside of the bugs for these specific issues. It would be ridiculous to expect NPCs to have complex reactions, as there's could be dozens on screen at any given moment. The unfortunate reality of bigger open world games is that you're gonna have a lot more reliance on smoke and mirrors, as well as a shallower world at times to compensate for the huge amount of space and scope. As an issue that many immersive systems don't really have, as they can relegate their space to small levels or hub environments that are far easier to control and add depth to, such as in Deus Ex. Breath of the Wild has a somewhat similar but more unique issue. Many of the systemic elements of Breath of the Wild add a lot of depth to the world, but the world itself is rather shallow and not quite expansive or bustling. This may be due to the Switch's limitations, but the point still stands. There's always going to be a hell of a trade-off however you choose to approach it. Some games just have to do things a lot more broadly, and some games can just focus a lot more of their depth in smaller spaces. The more systems you have, the more moving parts, meaning the more likely something can utterly fuck up and break. Cyberpunk 2077 probably should not have come out on last-gen consoles because of this. It was likely never going to work, but it's hard to completely blame CDPR when much of the game development expectations were set years ago in last gen. The scope likely progressively grew, and the limitations of nearly 7-year-old hardware began to show. It's inexcusable it was sold in the state it was, but it shouldn't have been that surprising either. But regardless, it's definitely not a good look, and it definitely should have just moved on to being sold on next-gen consoles and ported for those specifically, instead of trying to force them on the older gens. Marketing can also be blamed for a lot of wrong expectations for the game. I don't necessarily mean that in the scope either. People can, in their own minds, definitely create expectations for themselves that definitely don't match the reality of the game. After all, a lot of people expect more from a game when in reality, games are well, quite limited. What I'm talking about is more tonally than anything. When the Witcher series was marketed, it often painted itself as a grim, dark, self-serious fantasy setting. However, this couldn't be further from the truth, which is not to say the game was immature or didn't handle mature topics. While the marketing failed to acknowledge was a very human element of the game. If there's anything that is realistic about the Witcher series, it's that many of the characters are complex people with their own desires, feelings, and layers. No one is serious all the time, and all of us have depth to us. Geralt at a glance seems like a generic action hero. I mean, he certainly even sounds the part. But over the course of all the games, he definitely can shine in his generosity, kindness, sense of humor, sarcasm, and layers. Or at least there is the potential, as a lot of that is predicated on picking certain dialogue paths and role-playing certain options. Here, Cyberpunk often diverges from the advertiser's intent. Cyberpunk's best moments are often its most human, the often subtle and not explicitly violent moments. Its gameplay works best when it works within that framework as well. Otherwise, it can feel flat without motivation, and we'll get to that later. We'll get further into the story later as well, but for now it's important to know the game's writing is some of the best we've seen from the last year that's just passed. And the context it weaves around the gameplay is really core to the experience. It just wouldn't be as engaging without a lot of that narrative and a lot of the presentation that goes into the more high-budget elements of the game. In the game's many hours, the writing is likely going to be the biggest thing motivating you. It's the crux of the cyberpunk fantasy, and the intent of the game to sell you on that fantasy less through its moment-to-moment gameplay leads and more through its story and how the gameplay is interwoven within that. Without that motivation, the gameplay becomes less interesting independently, which is not to say it's bad or unengaging. In fact, the combat's pretty good, and the game is definitely fun to move around and explore, but it's not really anything special if we judge it purely on a mechanical basis. It's a similar problem the Witcher games have. The game is enjoyable when it works in tandem with the player doing the main quests and the side quests and the more engaging content, or even just getting to those side quests. But the RPG elements and the gameplay on its own are not really that in-depth and not really that great, but not necessarily bad either, as I just said. Breaking down the gameplay further, unlike the Witcher series that starts with a very set protagonist, the player can make their own V, the protagonist for Cyberpunk, of course. However, like Geralt, V is kind of very much their own person. They have their own voice, and they definitely have their own personality. The character V won't really do anything they normally wouldn't do. They are a merc. They're not necessarily a action hero with a heart of gold, at least not entirely. However, this is perfectly fine, as many RPGs, Deus Ex included, often have a set protagonist with their own voice and motivations. From here you further pick out your stats. These stats independently can serve as occasional dialogue and skill checks. While these checks are not likely necessary to progress in the game at any point, they do have their occasional bonuses like items or dialogue options. However, this won't really stop V from being able to do mostly everything at a base level at least. Every V can hack or craft to some degree. There's no weapons that aren't usable or no general abilities that aren't doable, though obviously the more complex stuff is tied to perks. The perks allow for passive bonuses and occasionally some new elements to the gameplay, but rarely do they ever drastically change the verbs of play or how you play. Like in previous CDPR games and some of the other RPGs, these perks are minor stat boosts typical of tabletop and traditional Western RPGs, which makes sense given the game's roots as a tabletop RPG, though I've heard it diverges quite a bit in many key areas. However, this means unlike immersive sim stat upgrades, which the stat upgrades will rarely have any meaningful changes for the player or how they engage. However, this means unlike an immersive sim, stat upgrades will rarely ever be meaningful for the player or how they play the game. Being able to hack turrets or jump from any height significantly changes how you view Human Revolution spaces and the approaches to every situation. So it's unsurprising some people will be disappointed with how one-note cyberpunk RPG systems are, especially the rather useless crafting skill. The one skill above all is that many others have noted is a complete waste of time. This is not to say the player has zero self-expression. For what it's worth, the game encourages specialization. It's impossible to unlock close to everything, so you're going to have to choose how you prefer to engage with the combat, and I do mean the combat mostly, as pretty much all the skills save hacking terminals are related to combat mostly. I mean, arguably even the crafting is combat related, as you won't be crafting anything that you won't use in combat. From quick hacks to what types of weapons you prefer, this will mostly define how you engage with the combat. While in games like System Shock 2, this is fine due to the inherent hostility of the nature of the game's space and story. I mean, you are trapped on a spaceship filled with monstrous aliens trying to kill you. This is somewhat disappointing in an open world RPG where dialogue options or hacking could have been found more uses outside of an occasional mission prompt. Something more akin to the Fallout games would have been appreciated. On top of that, there's another level up system called Street Cred, which the player will steadily increase over time doing similar tasks that normal XP would go up with. The uses of this are rather dubious and kind of pointless seeming. This might have just been a relic from the tabletop that they kind of just didn't know what to use for. I've heard this had a more interesting use before, in which NPCs could potentially react to your street cred, though much of that isn't really seen here. It only seems to unlock more side gigs, which we'll get to later, cars and vehicles, and some upgrades in the Ripper docks. Otherwise, it's a rather inconsequential to the player's overall experience, or their character build, really. Much of the gameplay involves combat, stealth, talking, driving, and hacking, a trait both Cyberpunk and Deus Ex series mostly share except for the driving, which Deus Ex does not have. With the exception of lackluster driving, this is generally quite fun. As I said, when it's working with the story and the side quests and the main quests and, moving from point A to B. The combat is overall rather excellent, and the quests have a good sense to vary up the narrative moments and quirky encounters, interesting set pieces, great characters, and that sort of thing. As some of the quests are entirely narrative driven, have no combat at all, so to speak. Outside of stuff directly related to the character and transportation, there is unfortunately rather limited interaction with the world outside of that. You can't buy property, and there's no really fun side activities unique to the setting like Gwent. Outside of the main quests and side quests, which are all in CDPR fashion well crafted and just really excellent, there's cyber psycho encounters, world combat encounters, as the aforementioned police encounters that require vigilante justice, racing, tarot card murals, and boxing. The cyber psychos are fun mini boss fights in the vein of the Witcher contracts, in which you find yourself fighting monsters after doing some detective work. And it follows a similar route here, as you have to investigate a cyber psycho case and then eventually fight them in a mini boss fight. If anything, I wish there were more of these and far more variety, as sometimes boss types may repeat. It would have been cool to fight a giant robot or mech or something, or have more unique combat situations in which the player could use their various skills. This does happen in some instances, but not enough, I feel. The Delamain side quests sort of fill a similar role as unique encounters and cheeky humor, and this is all appreciated. However, the constant calls the player receives to do these quests, a lot less so, and the player will be called throughout the game by various NPCs. While this is usually not annoying, this can sometimes not trigger or happen at really awkward times. The player can also purchase more vehicles, but you rarely, if ever, have enough money to buy them. And even when you do, you're not going to be able to get some of the more expensive stuff unless you forego a lot more other things, such as the enhancements the player can pick up, which are augmentations the player can slot in. It's often just easier to acquire vehicles through quests instead, honestly. Murals are a fun but not too difficult or annoying distraction that gladly keeps the collectible like side quests just that. However, the gang combat encounters, racing, and boxing are rather dull and clearly just the same sort of dull activities carried over from The Witcher. I mean, it's important to acknowledge the reality of development and sometimes resources that need to be pulled elsewhere, and it's just never that simple. It's unfair for me to ask for more when the story of Crunch regarding this game is so well known. But if there is to be more content updates or a future sequel beyond the absolute need to cut out the crunch culture from development going forward, it's worth noting that it's best if they don't try to recycle mechanics and side activities from The Witcher in favor of side activities that actually fit the setting a lot more, not that of a medieval fantasy game. Which finally leaves us with gigs as sort of the last side activity to cover. These sit in a rather awkward place, as many of them do have a narrative context or incentive. I mean, there's one where you drive a car and you'll hear banging from the back of the car. You could, investigate, or you should just deliver the car and ask no questions. And that's great, though rarely is that ever enough to truly make them engaging outside of a few aforementioned contexts. While some of these offer variety and interesting situations, the reward for them in terms of narrative content or actual rewards is not nearly enough to justify doing them outside of a completionist mindset or the need for some money. There are just regular story activities with far less story and more of a MMO go here, kill that, or stealth that than anything really unique or engaging within the structure or writing. Without any of the charm or scripted moments of the main or side quests, it's telling they're just not as fun to do. And more importantly, when I started a new game of Cyberpunk to record some of the footage I needed, I actually found myself far more engaged with starting the story all over again than doing a couple of gigs for recording. Cyberpunk probably has one of the strongest and most memorable openings I've played since Arcane's Prey back in 2017. Well, that's assuming the opening works as intended without any bugs. While some have shared disappointment the life paths aren't the deeper prologues they were perhaps intended on being much earlier in development, I think that's okay. In fact, the game rather briefly skips over a large chunk of events via montage, just to show V embedding themselves within Night City with their best friend Jackie, which we'll get back to in a second, as I really love Jackie in this game. Each opening is really damn strong, as a character backdrop for V and their story. From the outsider nomad perspective to the street kid who kind of feels like they always fit in to begin with. Essentially, CDPR is asking you what flavor introduction do you want, and how do you define your V, at least partially anyway. In my first run of the game, I started the game as a nomad, and found the path I took in the story and where I ended up with the nomad ending a really great arc for the character, or at least my V anyway. Getting back to Jackie, he's among one of the strongest and among many fantastic side characters within the game. He really just is kind of your bro, and you really come to sense your own and V's appreciation of the guy. I mean, especially in some other dialogue choices later on. Especially well after he's gone in a tear-jerking funeral sequence. His voice actor delivers the character in a really genuine way, as do a lot of characters. While his presence is short-lived, unfortunately, it's replaced arguably by the star of the show, Johnny Silverhand, Keanu Reeves' character. Keanu Reeves probably could have phoned it in here, but he brings a real passion to the work. I've heard some people say he's miscast, but I feel this is more due to his recent internet association and persona that's been created by people than Reeves as an actual actor, as he's played plenty of darker, brooding characters, just as much as his more eccentric roles. Silverhand is a likable guy, albeit an asshole at times, but one could down some beers with him and have a good time, so to speak. Like many of the characters, you'll appreciate the various layers of Silverhand that undoubtedly is quite charming. Watching V and Silverhand's relationship grow is quite endearing, as well as a source of a lot of fantastic moments. It's just a shame that the ending kind of forgets about it, having them all of a sudden be on cold terms again. It's a rather jarring shift, but it's mostly forgiven for the strong back and forth we have prior to the ending. He's never annoying, and while he may never be right sometimes, you may ask yourself if it's worth following his advice at times. It's definitely an interesting character. Johnny and the other side characters have very strong and surprisingly lengthy quest lines themselves, as sort of mini campaigns that were all fantastic, and probably the true heart of the game's story, more so than even the main story. Each character bringing their own unique personality, perspective, and quest lines that add a lot of depth to the world, and a lot of life to the setting. Alongside these quests, there are some absolute standout quests, such as the Ghost in the Shell parade mission for the main quest, or a Silverhand flashback mission with that really awesome pistol. I can't stress enough how sudden but fucking cool the Silverhand sequence is. The first one, anyway. The second one's also pretty great, but the first one's a real standout. From the eerie entrance decades prior to the game's events, or how the beat of the music really feels in line with the player popping Arasaka heads, to the personality in the reload animation. It's clear above all else most of the love and effort has gone to the main and side quests, and as well as most of the writing. However, unfortunately it's worth acknowledging that these moments can be ruined entirely if the game decides to bug out. While I personally never had this happen, I've had friends remark on the game being breaking during critical narrative moments, making what could have been cool or somber, sad, funny moments hilarious or frustrating when they really weren't intended to be. Finally, it's worth noting while there is an illusion of choice here and there, I mean, you're not going to really shape the world in any massive ways. There are some genuine choices that really shape the game's story, and the game accounts for it. While it's likely not to be in depth as any sort of isometric RPG, I think it's really admirable what they have here, and it's enough to make it really engaging and worthwhile. With that said, let's explore a cyberpunk game that doesn't put you in the shoes of a punk. In fact, you're going to be in the shoes of more of an authority figure, if anything, with clearer but not necessarily better thematic intentions and much more focused design. Deus Ex Human Revolution, when it released in 2011, had rather larger shoes to fill. The original Deus Ex was one of the three most pivotal immersive sims to come out for modern games, the other two being Thief and System Shock 2. It brought forward open-ended design, choices, secrets, and a conspiracy-heavy plot that in many ways is more relevant with its themes and ideas than a lot of cyberpunk fiction tends to be, as most cyberpunk fiction tends to focus on transhumanism or themes similar to that, like the aforementioned Deus Ex Human Revolution. Like with the shift to System Shock to Bioshock, there must have been a strong temptation to oversimplify the experience. Thankfully, Deus Ex Human Revolution is far more like Prey 2017 in that it has a lot of the depth of the original with some differing design philosophies here and there. Human Revolution thankfully streamlines where necessary, but maintains most of the mechanics and the spirit of the original, at least for the most part. Albeit the design philosophy is quite different here. In the original, much of the mission structure and level design was in both the more linear missions, or closed-off missions, as a better word for it, and the hubs incredibly open-ended. You tackled it how you saw fit, and the game gave a breadth of options how to interact with the world. The trade-off being the individual mechanics were going to be half-baked and a bit janky to begin with, but in a charming sort of way. Human Revolution, for its more linear missions, is far more linear, and its choices far more clearly laid out. You hack your way in, go through the front door, or use a vent, or any other options. It's a far more obvious choice than ever, but that doesn't mean it's a limited choice either. However, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as I've said, and the hubs are incredibly layered and far more open-ended in terms of approach. The communication of the past is still very clear, though. Furthermore, within the level spaces, the player is often encouraged to backtrack or interact with as much as possible, as player capabilities and XP gain are tied to hacking and exploring and knocking out guards and exploring every nook and cranny, far more so than the original incentivized it. However, while these design philosophies differ, there is still a fantastic level design on display here, with plenty of interesting choices in terms of gameplay and narrative thrown at the player, far more so than previously mentioned Cyberpunk 2077. Where Deus Ex succeeds here is in its detail and systemic play. It can far more convincingly sell an environment as a more interactive space by the cost of size and scale, but I think that's a worthy trade-off. This often being why most immersive sims sell for more linear, albeit open-ended levels or hub environments, as it's easier to cram in space, interactivity, and systemic play and detail in the broader strokes here. However, I only wish the map was a bit better, as it only shows the objective it's on the level you're on or the floor you're on, meaning a lot of awkward guesswork has to go in assuming where spaces connect. Space is also quite dense in Human Revolution, which can occasionally make backtracking or exploring tedious. Well, occasionally, not often. While larger areas at times, there was a greater simplicity in the original Deus Ex or even other immersive sims like 3 that made the hubs easier to traverse when in need of backtracking or getting from point A to B. I think that's a little better, as Deus Ex Human Revolution can have some spaces that often feel, as I said, tedious to go through. And larger spaces aren't necessarily better spaces, as condensed as they are. But again, as I've said, this is more of an occasional issue than anything. That said, I think fundamentally these minor issues don't really change how good the level design is for the most part, especially considering how good the main and side sort of missions are, allowing the player to further explore the hub environments, and it's clear a lot of thought and care went into these terms of integrating them all very cleverly into the levels and hub environments. The player will not find themselves having nearly as many skills as in Cyberpunk. Instead of a skill system and an augment system being separate, they're all kind of rolled into one here, albeit it's worth noting that Cyberpunk almost certainly drew its influence from Deus Ex here, then coming to its own independent conclusions on that. You will have less tools, weapons, and skills, but a lot more of it's meaningful and impactful. Praxis is the game's upgrade currency that can be either gained through getting enough XP and leveling up, or through exploration, or simply buying them. Most things reward the player with XP, so the player never feels they need to kill X guard or grind X thing out. They'll get XP regardless by just playing the game. However, this encourages the player to grind XP in other senses, such as hacking every safe or hacking every computer when they might necessarily not want to, which can definitely affect the pacing at times. Getting back to impactfulness, each new ability on some level drastically affects how you engage with the game. Hacking often has more obvious uses of opening up routes, more equipment, and turning enemies' tools against them, but other abilities like the ability to jump higher or the incredible social dialogue skill can open up paths that the player may not have originally intended to use or not known about, and allows the player to engage with the environment and the game in kind of in a Metroidvania sense, and in a far more engaging sense as well. Speaking of which, the dialogue system is probably one of the most engaging aspects of the game. Unlike traditional RPGs, where having the player just have enough some sort of persuasion stat is enough to change someone's mind, the player actually has to put some work in. And I really appreciate that and really love what they did here. The game will give detailed information on what the character's personality quirks are and the very subtle cues, such as the NPC moving closer towards you if you're convincing them more, or moving away when you're not convincing them, or speaking far more clearly when they're not convinced, and stumbling on the words when they are being convinced. I really wish more RPGs adopted this sort of system, where instead of just having a singular dialogue check, the player could be presented with many options and have to deduce what the character wants to hear versus what the player wants to hear. Outside of this, player has a depth of weapons, tools, and grenades to engage with. Nothing feels useless or out of place. There is every ability and every piece of gear for every playstyle, including tricky ghost or pacifist styles of play. This, coupled with the augments, makes combat, exploration, stealth, and the overall gameplay so much more fluid in the moment-to-moment play and engaging than the original Deus Ex. Now, I don't mean better, I just mean it flows a lot better. The stealth is easier to pull off, and it feels less janky, but the original Deus Ex definitely still has really strong gameplay. And the jank and some of the less polished elements can lead to a lot more interesting elements that were not intended by the developer. Albeit the more vague and open-end design is definitely missed from the original Deus Ex as well, which means it's a hell of a shame the boss fights suck so much, as one of the only aspects of the gameplay that just is flat out bad. They're simply not fun, forcing the player into awkward and incredibly hard combat encounters that don't gel well with the rest of the game in terms of mechanics or pacing. While the director's cut gives the player more options so it feels a lot better to play, it's still no less frustrating and awkward to deal with. Much in the same way the bosses in Metal Gear games, while cool, were often frustrating and awkward more than they were enjoying, or in line with the majority of the gameplay beats. Another awkward bit is the DLC that is included as part of the main game, with the director's cut. The gist of it being the player temporarily loses their weapons and abilities and has to slowly regain them over the course of the DLC. The DLC is fine for the most part, but it's a bit too long and it tanks the pacing. Whereas in the original release, just as you became incredibly powerful and you began to have access to a ton more options, to the point it might have been starting to feel a little too easy, the game was near its end. This just kind of drags on and the experience just doesn't feel nearly as good with the addition of it. It was probably best to just not be included at all. And I certainly didn't look forward to it while I was replaying the game. Though, again, it's fine and in many cases enjoyable, but it's just not really necessary, and it's just not great for the pacing. Visually, Deus Ex still to this day is quite a treat, even 10 years on. There's a lot of style and character that has gone into it. However, it's often at odds with the original Deus Ex's more grounded presentation. It looks way more futuristic and advanced in many cases, environments like Hengshot being laughably out of place, and more in place within some sort of far more futuristic setting like Star Wars' Coruscant than on Earth. This is actually kind of fixed in the sequel Mankind Divided, as the setting definitely feels a lot more believable. The yellow filter and some of the more absurd environments are toned down in what feels like a much crisper space in Mankind Divided for sure. With all that said, the visual style is pretty damn impressive and shows a lot of character through it. Moving on to the story, Adam Jensen definitely fits the bill of a lot of early 7th gen characters, being designed as a tall, brown-haired white dude with a gruff voice, but the voice actor actually does bring a lot of charm and snark to the character, which makes him a really fun on-screen presence. Even if a little generic at times, he still really stands out and is quite unique for 7th gen protagonists. Human Revolution certainly has stronger storytelling through its writing and animations than the previous games. I mean, that much is obvious. The player engages a lot more with the side characters as real people than walking philosophical talking points, while a little less up to its own ass too. It definitely feels a little less smart than the original. Similarly to Bioshock, it's a game that touches on a whole lot without saying much meaningful about it. Its themes are kind of all over the place, and they don't really hit super hard or come off as more cheesy than anything. Utilizing the same rather awkward racism allegory that X-Men does, with its superpower populace and the ideas of transhumanism, it just doesn't really work as a racism allegory, and as a transhumanism allegory, it's rather confused. Worse still, the sequel really doubles down on that, the sequel being Mankind Divided, of course. It's not that the ideas presented here are poor per se. As our world rapidly advances, the question of who benefits is an interesting way to examine class disparity and how race could affect it, but it's simply not as good as it could be, or as clever. Further made worse as it tries to cram in a conspiracy later on to be more in line with the original conspiracy-heavy plot. It just kind of doesn't make sense and feels rather awkward. Also, as much as the more human element of the characters is expressed here, it isn't really near complete with the better characters or sub-stories of Cyberpunk 2077. Jensen really is the only star of the show, sadly. This is made worse by the ending, or the choice of endings. The player is literally seated in a room with a bunch of buttons to press to get a small cutscene with Jensen talking over it. That's really it. It's stupid and a choice retconned by the sequel. The fact that there is an achievement for pressing all of the ending buttons further shows how poorly considered it was. It's just not really great. That said, while the main quest's writing may falter on a closer examination, the side stories have much richer writing, but as mentioned prior, not really quite as well written as Cyberpunk, but with much better gameplay. Ultimately, I feel both games are successful in fulfilling the Cyberpunk fantasy in differing ways, which speaks to the degree in which, while there is a lot of overlap between Western RPGs and immersive sims RPGs, there's a rather clear-cut differences in immersive sims and immersive sims RPGs versus Western RPGs in design philosophies and how the player is immersed in these games specifically. Deus Ex Human Revolution excels in its gameplay and systems, played to the strengths that almost all immersive sims that have fundamentally fantastic gameplay. While the world building is quite strong, you're going to feel the experience the most through its mechanics and how you interact with the environment and the choices you have. Cyberpunk, on the other hand, excels in its storytelling, with world building and presentation even more so than Deus Ex, much to the benefit of current hardware. The player feels immersed in their role through its story more than shooting gangs in a drug dens ever will make them, in terms of the side content anyways. Which is not to say the gameplay isn't used to reinforce this or that it's not fun, but the limitations, the interactivity, and choices in the gameplay are far clearer. Furthermore, many people on consoles due to management incompetence and crunch won't be able to play what is otherwise a great experience due to poor console ports. The biggest takeaway is that games cannot be perfect in every measure. No large or ambitious game can exceed in every category. These expectations of there being a perfect game to end all games is just that, a fantasy. Even the Cyberpunk fantasy is, at the end of the day, just a fantasy, so we just have to hope that games can explore them in differing and far more interesting ways than trying to hit every note possible. So instead of that, we can see devs explore the fundamental question of delivering the fantasy of the desired experience in unique ways. My hope is that the recent popularity of Cyberpunk will allow another Deus Ex to be made, and have them expand on the design ideas and scope of the game, and maybe try to work out a better story too. I also hope CDPR can further expand on making the gameplay side of things, while maybe not to an immersive sim quality or level, a lot more engaging, while of course sticking with the strong writing that carries most of the experience in subsequent expansions or sequels. That's all for now. Thanks for sticking around and watching this rather lengthy video. Please feel free to share your thoughts and feedback, and this will hopefully be the first of many critiques, and hopefully those other critiques will be of a better quality too.